so much, thanks everyone for coming in. This is amazing turnout. I was worried, like, oh, no one's gonna come to our thing in the middle of the day. It's so exciting, but not at all surprising. So I'm so happy to be here to introduce Silvia Federici, and I just want to tell a little story. A couple of years ago, I was at a party, and it was just like this grungy queer punk party, and I was in a room hanging out with a bunch of other femme dykes, and I was telling someone about Caliban and the witch. I was describing, here's the argument, and someone else was walking by at the party with her beer, and she was almost went by us, and then she said, "What? Are you guys talking about Caliban and the witch?" And then so then we had this gaggle, and people kept coming in the room, and we were like, "Get out! We're talking about Caliban and the witch," But it was this whole room of punk rock girls just sissing down instead of broing down over this amazing book. So it does not surprise me at all to see this kind of turnout for Silvia Federici. She's a professor emerita and teaching fellow at Hofstra University. She was a co-founder of the International Feminist Collective and the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa when she was teaching in Nigeria, correct? Yes. And she's an organizer she was an organizer for the Wages for Housework campaign, which I actually had when I was a little kid, my parents had some kind of Time Life book about women and feminism, and I would look at it over and over, and there was a picture of Wages for Housework, and all these women, and it was like 70s hairstyles and their boots and everything, and I was just like, wow, they are so cool. So they're one of my favorites. Silvia's books include Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, Revolution at Point Zero, Housework, Reproduction, and Feminist Struggle, Re-enchanting the World, Feminism and the Politics of the Commons, Witches, Witch Hunting and Women, and her newest monograph, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, Rethinking, Remaking, and Reclaiming the Body in Contemporary Capitalism. So please give it up for Silvia Federici.
Thank you very much, Len, and thank you very much to you all for this very, very warm, welcome. And I'm so happy to be here. It's always great to be back in San Francisco in this area. And I'm going to change a little bit what I was planning to do, because I figured, I'm not going to talk about, how we began Wages for Housework and how I got to write Caliban and the Witch and so on. And this morning, looking through the books, I found this book, and I won't mention which book it is, that basically I could be surprised because it completely wiped out the whole story of the work that we have done, pretending to talk about, in fact, the story of reproduction and so forth. And so I decided, maybe it's time to also take a little journey, and in this presentation, sum up some of the points, some of the development of the perspective that I'm going to present today. So, in the 70s, I come from that generation of feminism that, in a way, began a whole process of critique of traditional revolutionary politics and revolutionary understanding of capitalist society, the socialist Marxist tradition, because we realized as we were, searching for analysis that may explain, the particular form of exploitation and oppression that women suffer in capitalist society. When we turn to the classical books, we didn't find what we were looking for. And so we began a whole analysis starting from our own personal experience. And we realized that the revolutionary tradition of socialism and anarchism as well had completely ignored a very large sphere of human relation and activities. And we also discovered that before us, that kind of critique had already been initiated by the anti-colonial movement. The anti-colonial movement and also the movement for civil rights and black power and many black theoreticians had in fact, taken Marx and the socialist tradition to task, for having always privileged the wage industrial worker, which is primarily white and male, and not having seen the large population of the colonized, of the enslaved, who have been very, very central to the accumulation of capital, to the beginning and development of capitalist relations at every stage of that development. And having always identified work, labor, with wage work, and primarily with industrial work. So we realized we were in a tradition, right? And but what the feminist movement, or at least the type of feminism, anti-capitalist feminism, that I was part of, was a feminism that saw, uncover the whole sphere of reproductive relation, and we, have the work that we have done was to demonstrate there was nothing natural about those relations. Yes, and that this, what we call housework, reproductive work, was in fact work historically constructed and constructed in a way to benefit the labor market and to be functional and subservient to the reproduction of the workforce, and specifically the reproduction of our capacity to work, right? That our capacity to work, to be exploited, is not something that is given, something that is natural, but continuously have to be produced and reproduced. It's a particular type of production, right? So we began to develop a different conception of what is capitalism. The capitalism is not just centered in the factories, but it's constructed through a much broader world. If we think of capitalism as an assembly line, that assembly line runs through the communities, the homes, and so on, because the community and the home is a particular type of factory. It's a factory where you produce workers. You don't produce cars, you produce the workers who produce the cars, And then we also began a whole analysis on the basis of that when we realized, housework is actually the production of the workforce. Then we began a kind of analysis of the wage relation, because we asked, how is it, if this work is so important, because without workers there's no capitalism, without workers there's no labor market exploitation, right? And so in a way the reproduction of the workforce is the support, is the pillar of every work activity. Then why, if it is so important for the capitalist class, it is not recognized? And then we came to the conclusion that in fact the more exploited and the more productive a kind of work is in the history of capitalism, and then the more the capitalist class invisibilizes it, the more they have to hide it. And that's in fact the whole rhetoric of racism and sexism, right? They're all in fact ways of covering up what are forms of super exploitation, of particularly brutal, particularly intense form of exploitation, and making it appear as if they were incidental or if they were related, to the personality of the workers. And so that they can get away, in a sense, with having to remunerate, to recognize, and to return any part of the wealth that is produced that way. So we began this whole analysis of the wage relation, which I think has been very, very important, an analysis that basically began to look at the wage mostly as a political instrument, right? As not only a means for accumulating wealth, by not paying, right, a large amount of labor, but a way also of creating hierarchy, a way of creating inequalities, as a production, as an instrument for the production of inequality. And then also see the capitalism has been able to perpetuate itself, not only, through the accumulation of wealth and so forth, but through that accumulation process also to incessantly create hierarchy, create division, create it. And the wage relation is being a tool to naturalize many forms of exploitation, to make them appear as non-work or as something different from capital, as pre-capitalist, as non-capitalist. And in fact, two of the objections that we used to get commonly, to our analysis was, oh my God, you're talking about the household reproduction as being, capitalist work, but this is, capitalism is the factories, industry, it's no technology. Capitalism brings people together in a factory. Housework is pre-capitalist. On the other hand, you had people say, oh my God, the family, sexuality, child raising, this is the only area that is free. You are bringing in capitalism in something that is really the only island, of free relation where we care for each other, etc. I had a slogan at the time that actually has become quite popular. They call it labor, we call it unpaid labor. They call it love, we call it unpaid labor. Right. And so, in fact, it was the kind of response that put me on the path of historical work. They put me on the path that eventually led to Caliban and the Witch, because I wanted to be able to show that in fact, housework is not something natural, because if you look at society, for example, right, where production is for consumption, where people are producing for subsistence, then you don't have that separation between wage and non-wage, work and non-work, between production and reproduction. Those kind of separation, I knew they did not exist, in a society. Imagine even a society of subsistence agriculture, for instance. When you are going to the fields and you're producing, food and so on, what is production and what is reproduction, right? So that's how I began to do the historical work that eventually led me to go back to the beginning of capitalism, because I wanted to understand, what capitalism is to begin with, how it came into existence, also to defeat all the conception of very, very evolutionary conception of history that, just history is like a path. It gets better and better. And you go from, form of enslavement, and then we have wage labor, and then we have... And I have to say that some of that you still have, for example, in Marx. There is a conception in Marx that somehow, with capitalist development, there's going to be, and the spread of industrialization to every part of the world, there's going to be a homogenization of work, right? So that, for example, forms of work that are not industrial are seen as residual of a previous society. But the idea is that eventually, and in fact Marx was very optimistic. He thought that eventually capitalism was laying the foundation, the material foundation for a communist society, by developing technology, by developing industry, and that at one point we have a revolution, and we snatch industry and the means of production from the hands of the capitalists, and we set them work for ourselves. I don't buy that anymore. I don't buy that. There's a lot that has been missed in that picture, and not accidentally what Marx predicted has not taken place. And I think that what has been missed is also related to the fact that Marx has not seen the whole area of reproduction, has not seen the production of inequalities, and even in terms of slave labor. You'll be surprised in the 3 volumes of Capital how rarely Marx speaks of slave labor. And he was convinced in the same ways as with Housework that these were residual form. Yes, slave labor in the American plantation is part of the production of capital, but he really thought that this was some sort of an anomaly, that with the development of capitalism, that anomaly would be overcome. And you know, Marx even sent a letter to Lincoln as the head of the First International when Lincoln declared, you know, the Declaration for Emancipation of the Slave. So he was very much convinced, you know, that there'll be this trajectory that would lead. And I think, you know, I've learned tremendously from Marx, as you can see from my work, but I also think that we have to distance ourselves, you know, from some of those assumptions, and particularly the idea that capitalism was a necessary evil. That capitalism was the instrument of a higher rationality, you know, that basically through dirt and exploitation and suffering brought into the world, you know, the means for the liberation of humanity from the tyranny of labor. And I think that's a very important. So to me, Caliban and the Witch was in fact a long path that was very, very useful. It has helped me tremendously to understand, you know, the history of capital development, what capitalism is, the role of gender and race relation within it, and I have to say, and the role of the witch hunts, for instance, as a key moment in the formation of modern capitalist society, that the witch hunt was not a peripheral persecution, but in fact was extremely important because in a way it was functional to the creation of a new sexual division of labor, you know, to the attack on the social power of women, you know, the process of increasing subordination of women to men, you know, in the new capitalist society, you know, and also as a general attack not only on women and gay people, because the witch hunt was also used massively against gay people. Very, very often gay people were burned before or after, you know, women accused of witchcraft on the stake. And so it was also used, you know, as a tool to undermine, you know, the struggle that people were making against the advance of capitalist relation. And as I pointed out in the book, for those who have not read it, you know, the witch hunt was also exported, you know, to what we call now Latin America, particularly Brazil, Colombia, parts of the Andean region, and was very much used to create a whole new misogynous world, a new relation among women and men, and also to break down the resistance of people to colonization, to conquest. Now, in a way, after they finished the book, I never closed that chapter. To me, the question of the witch hunt has remained, you know, and as you can tell from the smaller book that I've published recently, which is Witch Hunting and Women. And there are very important reasons why. And part of it is because in recent time, you know, just about as I was finishing, you know, the last pages of Caliban and the Witch, around 2000, 2001, I was receiving news. I was reading about new witch hunts taking place in parts of Africa, India, and of course, well, first of all, I was horrified. You know, I was horrified, but also I began to be interested in understanding what forces would motivate this return to Re-enchanting. And of course, one assumption that I pursued was that they will be connected and rooted in the new forms of capitalist accumulation, right? Because since the 1970s, in fact, at the end of the 70s, as you know, there's a whole process of restructuring of the global economy that is continuing into the present, right? A restructuring of the global economy that has form of violence, extremely violent, that so violent that it takes us back to the beginning of capitalism, right? To that period of the 16th, 17th century, you know, when you have massive expulsion of peasantry from the land in Europe, you have the conquest, the slave trade, and the setting up of slave plantation in the American, right? So the new forms of the economic restructuring, they begin at the late 70s. And, you know, with more time, we could go into detail, understanding why we have that. And quite quickly, I can only say that my thesis is that this was a response, it was a new counter-revolution, what we call neoliberalism, globalization, the expansion of capitalist relation across the world. It's really a response, to the revolutionary process that culminates in the 60s and 70s, with the anti-colonial struggle, the struggle against racism, against apartheid, the civil rights movement, black power, then the feminist movement, student movement, anti-war movement, etc. There is a moment in which really the bottom, right? Looking backward now, we can really appreciate even more how important that period was. That for all its limits, the limits of the radical movements, that generated it, but they nevertheless, shook up the world. It gave a big shock to the capitalist castle and certainly began to subvert some of the mechanisms that capitalism has used to perpetuate its power, particularly the hierarchy. For example, the refusal, the anti-war, anti-Vietnam War movement, I think, was very important because there was an element also of critique, important critique of colonization, of imperialism. And the feminist movement, all the gender hierarchies, the civil rights movement. So these very carefully constructed, divisions, among the world proletariat, among the world of the oppressed, were being shaken at their roots. And I believe that the restructuring of the global economy was certainly a political response to that. It was a way to undermine forms of organization, forms of labor that had been particularly, important to the kind of subversion that we saw through the 60s and 70s. So my work I had the great fortune in the early 80s, as the new globalization drive was taking off, to spend a lot of time in Nigeria, and where I was teaching. I was offered the possibility of teach there for a while, and I arrived at a time when the Nigeria, like other African countries, were confronting, what has come to be known as the debt crisis, right? The debt crisis, it's a scandalous concept. For example, the African would have a debt, to American bank, to the American or European, after they've been savagely robbed of humans and resources for generation and generation, right? But believe it or not, the debt crisis that was, engineered, in 1979 in Washington it was engineered by the US Federal Reserve, by a simple maneuver, the increase in the rate of interest on the dollar. That, just that. And what you have is that, after the end of the process of the decolonization, many newly independent countries, now they had their flag, they had their government, were encouraged by foreign banks and government to take loans so they could catch up, they could development. In Latin America, many times people have said, they call it development, we call it violence. We call it violence. So in the name of development, they were convinced to take this loan, and then at very low interest rate. Then the interest rate goes up, the payment becomes unmanageable, and the countries are all on the verge of defaulting. Those were all of my generation know, for example, 1982, Mexico was on the verge of default, Mexico. And then comes the World Bank, I call them the cavalry. The cavalry, and they say, oh, no, you're not going to default. Here, new loans, but you have to reform. And they called it structural adjustment. And structural adjustment is a particular set of maneuvers, of policies that brought back the newly independent country way back to where they were under colonialism. Structural adjustment. So the globalization, neoliberal phase of capitalism begins, and in fact, in a foundational way, begins with the recolonization of what had been a former colonial world. Right? The recolonization meant, now, cut all investment, to the reproduction of your people, medicine, schooling, university from elementary schooling, healthcare, cut. There was a time in Africa you could travel to the campuses and you saw this building half built, right? They had begun to build, and then came structural adjustment, and nothing was finished because all the money was drained to pay for the debt, And then the economies had to be restructured, so that all production had to be for the payment of the debt, directed to export, right? And then they were told, well, how are you going to pay? Well, cut your forests. Open up, make great deals for oil companies, make great deals for mining companies. And the World Bank has written down, I have some of those books, the mining code, the code for how countries can negotiate mining, relation with mining companies. I say all of this, it may seem that I'm taking a long road to where I want to go. But it's very important, in fact, to my work, and also important to our politics down to this moment. Because the big migratory movement, the big migration movement that begin already in the 80s, right, were not spurred by the fact that, the United States was or Europe was such a great country, right, the American dream. No, they were spurred by the fact that people could not survive, in the countries of origin, exactly because of the policies that were cooked up in Washington and by the European community. So that we have, this history is very, very important to our politics today, particularly when we talk about immigration, right? Because it is a scandal. In the same way as it was a scandal to speak of a debt crisis for Africa or for Latin America, and that who owes to whom? Right. I think that we continuously have to say who owes to whom and turn the table. And the same thing also is with immigration. Why are people coming here? They're coming here to take back some of what has been stolen from them. Not only historically from the 15th, 16th century to the present, but also in more recent time to the program of structural adjustment and discontinued repayment of the debt, a debt that was artificially created. So this has been part, my contribution to this, or my small contribution, right, to the analysis of this period and the politics that I generated from above and from below, has been to look, and this is where revolution at point zero comes from, has been to analyze, what have been the consequences, the impact, of these processes, right, on the organization of reproduction internationally, right? Because first of all, it has been very clear to me, and not only to me, that what we call globalization, in all its different policies, it's really a major war on people's ability to reproduce themselves, right? A war waged with massive privatization of land, so dispossession, expropriation, attack on communal land ownership, right? Also through austerity program, disinvestment in education, in healthcare, etc., and precarization of labor, right? So there is a connection to all of them. There is a common denominator if you line them up, and the common denominator is that's made it more and more difficult for most people across the world actually to survive, actually. And I can add the whole attack on housing. I mean, it's a scandal that in this country as well, more and more we're becoming a population of homeless people, right? And now you cannot turn a corner without people actually living in the street. And that's part of that process of expropriation, of dispossession. And it's very important to see, and this is another political lesson that we need to carry in our pocket, whatever we do, whatever politics we do, which is that there is a continuity, there's been a continuity between the impoverishment and dispossession of millions across the former colonial world, and what has taken place in Europe and in the United States. That the attack on every entitlement and then the attack on work relation and benefits, etc., here has been premised and built upon, in the dispossession and mass impoverishment, across Latin America, Africa, etc. That's very, very important because they're not disconnected. And of course, the lie that has been sold, that in the United States we benefit from imperialism. Some do, some do. Unfortunately, they're not a small group. But the majority, in fact, is being impoverished. There is a continuity, even though that impoverishment is different form. So I have been very interested in understanding, in particular, what happens to reproduction work, what happens to care for the elderly, housework, children, child labor, indeed, child labor has increased, across the world. But I mean, child raising, and the conclusion, in an essence, is that we are facing now a massive, massive crisis of reproduction. A massive crisis of reproduction, of which, the decline, constant decline of life expectancy is a very clear symptom. The increase of suicide among children, among young people, among the elderly is also an expression. And that, increasingly, life is breaking down, at the seams. And with that, we have also seen a major increase in the violence, in the general violence against people, against workers, against proletarians, against the dispossessed, and also in violence against women. And I'm using here women in a very broad sense, including women, trans women, and so on. So women I'm using in a very broad, not in a purely biological sense. This is some of the work that I've done because I think it's important to understand, when we analyze the new forms of violence, right, to see what is their connection, right, with the new forms of social, economic relation, the new form of work, the new forms of accumulation. And much of the work, theoretical and practical, I work in New York with a group of women. We have a website called Feminist Research on Violence, one word. We are still working on it. It's not that user-friendly because we are really incompetent, but we are working on it. But it's active, Feminist Research on Violence, and our concern is precisely to try to understand this different aspect of feminist activism, the whole issue of violence, the issue of the body, child raising, and so forth, and sexuality, and work, economic relation, access to resources, and how the new forms of economic life are also connected to the new forms of violence. This is part of the work that we have been doing and that I'm very interested to talk about today. To say, for instance, that we have been analyzing how these new forms of witch hunting that have been proliferating in many parts of the world are connected on one side, to the increasing attack on communitarian relation and processes of land dispossession, so that as you have, for instance, in Africa, often local chiefs, also in complicity with national government and foreign companies, right, who very often are moving into communities and forcing people out because they have to dig coltan or because they have to open up, a mine or an oil drilling facility, right? Then to break the division, to create a division in the community. Witch hunting and the image of the witch. And I want to say something here, the image of the witch and the witch hunt. It's a very, very particular type of charge that is extremely useful to divide people. When you say that somebody is practicing witchcraft, first of all, witchcraft by definition is a supernatural power. Those who practice in it particularly, presumably, are doing so in hiding in a very occult way. So you don't have to prove much. You have to say, she's a witch. She's a witch. Right? At night, she flies and she does this. So the whole process of actually evidence, is shortcutted. And also, it's the image of a person who is just evil. Right? There is not for gain, it's just evil. The old day witch was said to be the enemy of God, the enemy of humanity, the enemy of her neighbor, right? So but it's a very useful charge to divide up people. And so I'm looking in these books about the connection between the new enclosure, land expropriation, and the new witch hunts, right? Also, we are developing maps to show what are the situations within this neoliberal development that are really triggering much of the violence. For example, in Latin America, you find that a very common element in the violence is the fact that in so many communities, it's women who are in the forefront of the defense of the land, of the rivers, of the forest, when the companies are coming in, right? because women are the subject of reproduction. You know, when a river is poisoned, when the waters are poisoned, or the cropland is full of mercury, they know that the community is bound to die. They have to feed children. They have to deal with the people who are sick. So they are very often those who are right there to defending, you know, the forest against the logging. And they more and more have been the target of paramilitary, the army, and so on. You know. Also nowadays, women have to work outside of the home. You know, migration, very violent process. And with women, right, the threat of violation, the threat of rape, women take contraceptives when they decide to migrate. You know, and often they work in the night, on the street, selling things, and through the day, so in public space. Used to serve one man, now you serve 20. Now you serve a whole world of people in ways that you know, take you out even some of the protection of your community. You know? So we are looking at the militarization of life. The fact that more and more people are working with arms. There's been an increase, an immense increase in the number of people who are working with violence. Security guard, soldiers, you know, workers in jails. You know, basically, not only we have now permanent warfare, very connected to expropriation, but we have a permanent warfare, as you know, I mean, I'm saying the obvious, in our communities. So the demilitarization of life also is creating a certain, celebrates a new type of masculinity, right? Or very, very aggressive masculinity, you know, the kind of men with like arms everywhere, they can hardly walk. They have arms, they are monsters, right? They look like monsters, right? And that has an impact. You know, I was mentioning yesterday, talking about this, that Fanon, in The Wretched of the Earth, at the end of The Wretched of the Earth, he was very precise, you know, as he was analyzing the psychosis of French torturers, you know, who were dealing with the psychosis of people who were torturing in Algeria. You know, he was saying, obviously, because these were people who were going home and beating up their wife, saying, obviously you cannot divide, violence is indivisible. You cannot all day be violent with people and then go home and be sweet to your family, your children. And this is what is happening today in our communities also. So these are the kind of maps that we are, because we want to make a point. And I think this is one of the points that I'm making in my work and also in my activities, which is that we cannot fight, of course, against violence without fighting against the general condition of economic life, social, political relation. We cannot isolate the fight against violence, you know, from the struggle to transform the world against, you know, the new capitalist form of accumulation. And certainly we cannot fight violence by demanding more jail, by demanding more severe penalties, which, as it has been shown over and over and over, only gives more power to the police, more power to the government. And another point that is very important also is that violence is first and foremost institutional. And this is another issue that I think is very, very important for the feminist movement and for any movement of social justice. That the first form of violence is institutional violence. That all violence, in a sense, point to the institution, to the organization of society, to the economic structure. That we have to name violence not only what is done with a gun or with a knife or with a bomb, but we have to call violence, for example, an economic policy that dispossesses people, that forces people to go to the hospital at the last stage of metastasis because they don't have the money or the time to go before, etc. That's violence. The other day, 700,000 people were cut off from food stamps. That's violence. So we really have to rename violence. So this part of the work, the renaming of violence, and the seeing that we cannot fight against violence without at the same time attacking, many of the structural, economic and social structure that in fact are making it possible. I always say that, for example, if waitresses had to have the guarantee of a good wage, of a good, of resources enabling them to support themselves, they wouldn't have, for example, to be exposed often to the kind of abuse they have to be exposed and accept because they are dependent on a tip. Because to this day, the majority of waitresses in this country, literally have to cajole and make themselves seductive or at least be kind, even in front of abuse, because they do not have the right wage. I mean, this is one small example, but I think is indicative of a whole structure of injustice and a whole situation in which there's a direct relation between the structural economic violence of economic relation and the violence to which a lot of people, beginning with women, trans, and children, we don't talk enough about children's the violence against children, fundamental. And I'm going now to work towards a conclusion because I want to have time to have a discussion. And I want to say that equally important to this kind of analysis has been my work on what to be done and how are people struggling, what are the fall not only of resistance, but through the resistance, the form of transformation of our society. And, we have had all this debate also in my group, whether we should use the word resistance or not. And many women, they are very adamant about, no, we shouldn't use it. Because, yes, we want to resist, but it's not enough. And resistance is a very, and I've learned that it's good. But I've also learned that you cannot seriously resist any form of social injustice without at the same time transforming social relation. That actually many of the struggles that we call struggles of resistance are in that process also producing something new. They're producing, you cannot really engage in an effective resistance without changing your relation with the people with whom you're struggling. And this is something that I want to, in concluding this presentation, I want to really expand upon, because it's what I call the politics of the commons. And this has been taken on more and more space in my work, in theoretically and otherwise. The politics of the common is the politics that I see has already been acted out in many ways, in many parts of the world, in response precisely to the kind of expropriation, dispossession, impoverishment, right? And often manifests itself, by people, for instance, in many parts of Latin America, expelled from the rural area and going to, towns, taking over territory, taking over peripheries of cities, and building new communities through collective work, through cooperation. Right? These are the people who understand that if they do not stick together, if do not work together, struggle together, they are going to be destined to a very wretched, life and to a really defeat. And so in Argentina, they call these encampments villas. Villa Miseria, Villa 2124, Villa Retiro Bis. These are encampments, new cities that have now thousands and thousands of people. And they have been built through collective work. And women have played a very key role in it, right? Because women have really been in the forefront of creating all new forms of reproduction, more collective, more cooperative, like the collective kitchen. Collective kitchen means that you have places where maybe 10 women and some young men, are cooking for maybe 700 meals or 1,000 meals, and it's not the same women all the time. On Monday there's a group, Tuesday there's another group, and they do that, for very, very cheap resources, and making available. It's a whole new wealth that is made available to the community, and also cooking together, right? You talk, you are not alone, right? You exchange ideas, you exchange information. This is happening. What do you think, etc., etc. There's a whole viewpoint on social events that is being produced together with the food, right? The urban garden, and then all kinds of forms collectively produced for preventive medicine, recuperating, knowledge about herbs, about contraception, etc. There's a lot of that happening. I speak much about it on the basis of my experience, particularly in Argentina, and also Chile, in Re-enchanting the World. And I'm also being very interested in the way they're connected to this, commoning of reproduction. There's been a recuperation of the collective memory. There's a big, enormous awareness of the importance of memory, of the recuperating the history of those who have struggled in a particular locality before, those who have died, those who have sacrificed, and what has happened to an area. There's a recognition to recuperate his history, gives you power in the struggle, because it allows you to place what you're doing in a much broader context and to go beyond the limits of your individual life. This is the whole power of the commons, that you begin to think not in terms of me, or me and you, or me and my child, but you're beginning to think in terms of a broader conception of who is the family, who are the people around you, and solidarity. And so, in a way, history, recuperating the collective memory, is also solidarity with those who have died, with those who have struggled. Not only with the living, but also with those who struggle. And to say, no, the injustice that was done to you, the crimes that were committed against you, should not be passed into silence. We should not allow us to forget those crimes. But you are with us. When you say presente, this is what the power of collective memory. And there's a lot of that is done, and very consciously done. And in that vein, with a number of women in Spain, we have a number of projects, but one project has been to recuperate the memory, the history of the witches, of the witch hunts, because after the publication of Caliban and the Witch in Spain, we decided, just out of historical curiosity, to go to some of the places where women have been executed, where there were persecution. And we discovered, to our horror, that the witch hunts now are made, a big object of tourist attraction. Right? So along the roads, you might find, the picture of the witch with the broom, or you have the shops and shops where you can buy for 20 euros, you can buy your brujita, your little, bruja, and, totally misogynous, the teeth out, the satanic smile, right? And you see children walking away with it. And I feel like, oh my God, all over the story again, oh please. And so we decided, no, we got to do something. We'll go into the shops and say to the women who work there, why you sell this crap? And they said, yeah, we don't like it, but our boss says, keep your cells. is cells, right? So you have the cup, the coffee cup, the apron, everything. So we said, okay, cells. Then we're going to do something. Then we're going to work on making sure it doesn't sell any longer. And we began a process of, first of all, organizing. We made a call and said, okay, we want, women, study groups, women who go into the archive. Let's do history from below. Because really, so many people don't have an idea of what really, if they knew what is behind these things that they are buying, they would not do it. So let's make it much more visible. Let's make what happened when this is where not allowing the history of the past to be forgotten. So we made a number of study groups of women who have gone into the archive. These are not historians, but they've gone and looked at the archival material and began to figure out what happened and it's already been very powerful. We had an encounter in Pamplona this year in March. We are going to have another one in October, and it was very powerful to see, the effects. Women who say, oh, I walked the streets of my town many years with my child, and I didn't know that on the streets, women have been burnt, right? And then reading the names of the women, it was like, and so this is the kind of recuperation, because in the process we understand what happened, what were the consequences of it, and gain insight into what is happening to us today. Because I've learned doing this historical work, that capitalism changes in many forms. They go through, particularly in response to struggle, they always have to reinvent themselves, as we have to reinvent the struggle. But at the same time, there are certain very structural elements that are always there. All through its 500 years of history, capitalism has always been a violent system, right? And the prosperity that it has granted to limited population, limited sectors of the working class, and for the limited amount of time. And otherwise, from the slave trade through colonization, and through now all the processes of dispossession, mass incarceration, and so forth, we see that the violence is a structural element. And similarly, gender, race, hierarchies are also structural elements. There is now still a debate by some historians, some Marxists, who say, oh no, you can imagine a capitalism that is not racist and misogynist, right? Because you can imagine logically a capitalism just based on the exploitation of labor without saying who that labor is. But I'm saying, yes, logically perhaps, but we're not dealing logic, we're dealing with history. When we look at the history, we see that in fact, right, this has been the structure, and it's going to be to this blessed end. And so, whatever struggle we do, whatever project we are in, I think we have to put into our struggle, into our program, the going beyond of capitalist relation. And that also begins with realizing that when we speak of the commons, we really speak of a particular logic, a particular way of organizing society, and also a necessity for the struggle. We cannot make effective struggle over a long period of time without reorganizing our daily life and without reorganizing, starting from the present, our life in a more cooperative way. Right? In other words, the commons is not something to come. Enough with that idea that revolution is like, a century away. I really do believe that it begins now. And as a necessity, because you cannot really struggle unless you reorganize the reproduction of your daily life, which means that we have to reorganize our life in a way that we tighten up, we create more effective ties among us, the struggle is not something abstract. It's not an abstract protest. It's not enough to show up for a demonstration, as important as that is. It's the way we organize our daily life, in a way that brings us more together, that we put our resources together, that puts our life together. And this reproductive, the need to reproduce ourselves and to create a different infrastructure, more effective, more based on solidarity for our struggle, I think is a fundamental condition, without which we will not be able, in fact, to, achieve any long-term positive result. Because people's lives are already very terrible. And very often, making a struggle looks like another piece of work. And, but it shouldn't be, That's why so many people might not want to a meeting, to a demonstration. And in that way, we have to change the way in which we struggle. And the last thing is, in my last book called Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, the last piece that I've written is called, Joy, it's in praise of joyful militants. Militants, activism, protest must be joyful. It doesn't mean that you may not run risk and suffer, but what you do has to have an element of joy in it. It must change our life for the positive. Otherwise, there's probably something wrong with our politics. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to open it to questions, and I want to try to take the mic. Oh, this one doesn't work. Okay. I'm going to...
jiggle the bottom of it, the cord sometimes.
No, it's
cord
off.
itself, yeah. No.
Here, I'll let you do it.
I'll try.
So I wanted to be the first question, so because I have a microphone. Silvia, so one question I had, you spoke about the expropriation of land and the use of witchcraft or witch hunting as a means of expropriating land. And it made me think about in the American drug war, or the war on drugs, one of the tools that was used during the drug war was if anyone associated with a person found dealing drugs or living there, or someone giving someone a ride who they didn't even know that's what they were doing, they could have their property seized, right? Or I also thought of during the Japanese internment, a lot of people were taken off of their land, taken out of their homes, and their land was taken from them. So my question is, why witchcraft? Why does sometimes witch hunting serve that role, and sometimes these other techniques, like this, this drug war technique, or this mass incarceration of the Japanese? Like, why, when, and why does witchcraft and witch hunting get used in that way?
Yeah, there are obviously different contexts. One element in this proliferation of charges of witchcraft has been associated with the massive presence that has grown over the 80s and 90s and again continues of evangelical Pentecostal sects, many of them financed by the right wing, who have gone to communities who were being destabilized by economic austerities, and extractivist politics and so on. Communities where had already many people migrating, and proselytizing on this basis of, you're poor, that's because something wrong with you, or maybe people in your community are conspiring against you, and they have all this thing about Satan. There is a Satan conspiracy, and you have to be very careful. And they're really spreading. It's like the cultural equivalent of a neoliberal think of yourself, don't think of the community. you know, but watch out about what people are doing. And also, it's very much connected to the fact that it's targeting against women, connected to this really big drive among women in so many places to recuperate a lot, for instance, of, you know, old knowledges about herbs, healing practices. There's a lot of that. The whole issue of healing, particularly you cannot rely on the hospital, on the medical profession for money or for other reasons. And so that too, the gardening, the defense of nature. So you're now charged of being a witch. You know, if you're interested in the trees, the plants, healing practices, and there's a lot. This has become part of many women's feminist movement struggle. And so that's where the charge of being a witch comes in. Yeah. Yeah?
I'm just interested because you're calling it witchcraft, and I'm really glad you brought the evangelical piece in.
Mm-hmm.
Evangelicals have moved into Africa, especially
Yes.
Uganda.
Uganda.
That Nollywood puts out as much movies as like Bollywood in America.
Yes.
A lot of the content of the Bollywood movies is about witchcraft,
Yeah.
Christians, and the presence of witchcraft. But also, witchcraft in Africa is African religion. So
But it's different because it's not based, right? Look, many, from what I learned, and you certainly know more than me, but
no, I don't.
yeah, but what I've seen is that, you know, many agricultural society or pre-capitalist society who have a deep conception and relation, where people have a big relation with nature, right? And they are much more sensitive to the idea that there are all these forces that, you know, might be benign or not benign, and you may have to do ritual. In Africa, for instance, one is the cult of the ancestors, and you have to do certain things for the ancestors. If you don't do it, they might not be nice towards you, right? But that particular notion of the witch, right, that it's very, which is all evil, the all evil person, right? It's like, you know, it's very much rooted in Christianity, the Christianity that basically divides the world into good and evil, God and the devil, right? And I've seen some of the manuals, I've seen them actually in Latin America, in Mexico, the handbooks. Because this stuff, actually in the past, I got a few handbooks also online that tell you how to recognize a witch. Friends I have in Ghana, they told me that they have television program. In Ghana, massive presence of Pentecostal groups. And for instance, they told me that in a number, even at the university, you know, now meetings are opening up with people crossing and speaking. So there's religion is being used again as, you know, in the 16th, 17th century with colonization. I often call the World Bank and the IMF the new missionaries. But actually, you know, with the IMF and the World Bank have come these evangelical. When I was in Nigeria, I saw a number of them. This was the beginning at the time. This was 1984, 1985. And they would go, at that time they were all white, often from the south. They would come with little trucks, covered by writings. I'm covered by the blood of Jesus. Yeah, they'll be, oh, please. And then they'll go to the market. They'll go into a little podium and they'll say, do you have a soul? Jesus, Jesus will do everything. So cover your eyes. You have a problem with your eyes and say, oh, Jesus, I have an eye problem. You have a problem with your stomach and Jesus will take care of that. So that was the beginning, and I thought, oh, weird, what's going on, right? And that was the beginning, you know, of as people were being more and more affected, right, by economic policies. Also came these who said, oh, it's not if you're poor, it's because there's something the problem. And this handbook begins with sin, the sinner, right? So they tell you how you're a sinner. and you're going to go to hell and die in the flames and whatnot. Of course, if you join with them. Then there is Satan, right? What Satan is doing. How do you recognize who are the acolytes of... Yeah, this is really a manual for dividing people, for, sowing. And as I write in my analysis there, which I took from what other people have said, is that, there's been a sense that now, with the new economic processes of globalization in many parts of the world, particularly villages and so on, people are losing the sense. There is a sense of disorientation because it's becoming more and more difficult to understand what are the forces that are shaping your life and your economic condition. Why you cannot sell your coffee? Why you cannot sell your coffee at the price of 5 years ago, 2 years ago? Why you have to? Because so many now of the decisions are not depending on the regional office of the government or they are now depending on a market in Chicago, right? On this big international market that are setting prices, etc. And so there is a whole atmosphere that is also generating suspicion, because you see some people prospering and you see, and this is really part of the context that is generating witch hunts. Yes.
Yeah, I want to fast forward a little bit.
Yes.
To now to late capitalism.
Yes.
We've seen as, for example, women incorporating into the capitalist class, such as...
Not all.
No, not all, but I'm saying some,
Yeah.
like Margaret Thatcher,
Yes.
the queen of neoliberalism, like the head of the
Yes.
CIA right now in the United
Right.
States is a woman.
Absolutely,
in
yeah.
Latin America, Violeta Chamorro was, puppet of the United States. So how does that represent it? And this, unfortunately, these women claim that they're feminists.
Yeah.
So I understand, and you correct me, that it is radical leftist feminism. How do you, meet with the challenge of these representatives of the ruling class against you in the question of women's rights and the advance against the capitalist class?
Right, yeah. This is happening across the board, everything. And I think it's very important. More and more, in fact, I think we speak of feminisms in the plural because there is not one feminism. Because you're right, not only women, but feminism has been used in the same as, human rights has been used as a tool in imperialism. You justify over and over invading country, torturing people in the name of human rights. So, I think what, in the 70s and 80s, the international capital and through the United Nations, they really understood the power of the women's movement. They understood that, the power of subversion. And they saw at the same time that they could co-opt it, in this demand that so many feminists made of being let in, to be, women's liberation by entering the male-dominated fields. Not that I'm against that, but if that is all of your struggle, then we are in trouble. Then we are in trouble. And they saw that they could use it. They could use it to reactivate the capitalist machine that was in crisis. Because in the mid-70s, capitalism was facing a crisis, and a crisis of control of work, control of exploitation. And in a way, a good part of the restructuring of the global economy has meant also, right, the precarization of labor, opening up the doors of wage work to women, but wage work without the benefits of the past, without any guarantee, at the lowest level. I found out, that I've been doing some work on women and debt, in the United States. You know, women are those who are carrying the highest amount of debt at all levels, mortgages, student, and credit card, right? And it's usually women who have a job, those who are carrying a lot of debt. Because the job doesn't pay enough to give you economic autonomy, but allows you, because you have something of a salary, to take a loan from a bank, right? So you actually wait for your salary, so you go to a payday loan. I mean, effectively, with women's wage labor comes the paid loan fee, and the interest rate are like 50%, because you have no collateral, so you are at risk. All you have is meager salary, right? And so that we have to be very clear, you know, when we speak of feminism. You know, in Latin America, we speak of popular feminism to distinguish from bourgeois feminism. You know, the one that are now are, you know, what is it? You know, the Commission for Women's Rights and et cetera, that are there to control actually other women. Yeah, but it's very important. Yeah. Yeah. There. So tell me. Yes. Yes.
Insights and resources about maybe how science has.
Can you speak a little
Yeah.
louder?
Yeah.
I'll repeat back.
Yeah.
So I think about Darwinism and how like survival of the fittest plays into this idea of capitalism and how people kind of buy into it based on the fact that like survival of the fittest and all of that. So I'm just curious if you have any critique or any facts or any resources about something that may critique that idea. So I think that those two things.
Yeah, I think that, yes, you know, maybe we can talk about later, but there is a literature, I think there is a literature to which also the feminist movement has contributed, of critique of all that Darwinism, which is still with us. You know, the survival of the fit, I mean, the whole thing about competition now, right? Still very much with us. It's not something of the past. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious about where do you place what you're thinking about how job classifications get determined of their value, based on kind of who's in that role and what it's actually producing, and you know, it obviously fits into the larger, but I'm curious
Right.
if you have specific thoughts about kind of how that gets so designed that certain jobs are valued and certain are not economically, like teachers and social workers, and you know, so the amount of
You
ways
know,
that-
I don't think. I mean, and I'm not going to give you a really very precise answer, but my general answer is that this is not that there is probably a classification book or master plan, but the fact that as a whole, you know, the power relation, women in such a power relation, where employers know that you have always been working for no money, that you have this long, training to working for no money at all, that the moment a sector becomes predominantly female, it's like almost an automatic thing that wages, are dropping. So, and I think it's very, very important, the devaluation of the whole sphere of reproduction has a consequence also when women go to work outside the home. And also the kind of jobs, right? The kind of jobs, because the majority of women are still doing an extension of housework. Even though women are now more present in sectors that were dominated by men, but nevertheless the majority of their work is still reproductive work. Yeah. So I'll take yes.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how mass incarceration impacts the whole issue of reproductive relations.
Yes.
And then a second little mini part is also there's a film called Southwest of Salem. Are you
Oh yeah,
familiar
they
with
told
it?
me. I haven't seen it, but they
Yes,
told me that it's very
it
powerful. Yeah.
draws out the
Yeah.
issue of demonizing women in the modern day carceral system
Yeah.
around women who are gender non-conforming and queer. So I just want to raise that.
Yeah.
It's a great film, Southwest.
Yeah,
of
Southwest
Salem.
of Canada. Yeah, I heard that. I haven't seen the movie. Yeah, I mean, look, the carceral system, it's like the continuation and the different title of, slave plantation. And in some cases you can see it almost, graphically, take a place like Angola in Louisiana, right? I don't know if Angola was literally a slave plantation, and you have the pictures from Angola slave plantation, and all the workers are slave, African, and then you have the supervisor, white man on a horse with a rifle, and today it's the same. The only thing is a jail, right? And you have young men, predominantly black, and you still have, and they are producing, they are producing agriculture, huge amount of agricultural product for the jail is selling. And then you have the supervisor. I mean, it's a continuation. And I think you're right about, the impact is never seeing the impact on the family.
Right.
And the same thing also with the death penalty. Yeah, we thought the death penalty is horrendous. Horrendous is also what it does to the family. The whole life of community of women, because they are the ones, in fact, when you have a long sentence and people, gradually forget who is in jail. It's the women who go. It's the women who deal with the trauma of the children, of seeing your father, seeing your brother in jail, who have to decide, I'm going to take this child or not, and having to do with all their work and their anguish. Yeah, there's a whole chapter, and this is even more extreme when you have the death penalty, so that's this is the struggle against slavery is still very much alive today. It's something that it has to be part of our struggle, whatever we do, in whatever movement we are. Yeah. And yes, oh yeah, you had your hand up, and then your hand, yes, yeah.
So I'm going first. Okay.
Yeah, you go first, and then you had the sure.
Well, thank you for your talk. It's really admirable. I will have a question specifically about your book, about the witch hunts. The shorter one, not the Caliban.
Okay.
One thing that I admired, among other things, about that book is we have this logic about capitalism, this assumption about capitalism that as it develops, it rationalizes stuff. It rationalizes labor, it rationalizes, it develops science and all of that, but you are kind of bending the stick to the other direction and you say, no, it actually mystifies a lot of stuff. And hence we have these crazy witch hunts. And I think that's really admirable. However, there is, I think, an argument in, not quite the other opposite direction, but, as capitalism develops, not always, but sometimes it also brings down, built-in case systems, and, stable, stationary status systems.
Oh, please.
For instance,
okay, I don't know if where you're going there, but I was just rereading recently, Marx's comments on India, and.
I'm not talking about that.
Oh, okay. Then quickly come to the question, because we are really coming to the end. Just come to the question, that because there are 2 or 3 other people.
Okay. Well, the question is, don't you think that there is a tendency of capitalism that allowed the women to speak up for themselves?
I don't know. No, I don't have the time to support what I'm saying. I'm just saying no. I don't think so. And I want to add something. You should read a little chapter on gossip. I wrote a chapter on gossip to see the change of the word gossip from the Middle Ages to the 18th century, when, in the period of the witch hunt, gossip used to mean my friend.
Yeah.
And then it becomes what it is now, bad talk, idle. So there's a whole thing when you read that chapter. But in that chapter, you also read that in the 16th, 17th century, women were seen as too talkative, protestive, rebellious, etc., etc. They were muzzled. They would place, a contraption of leather or metal, the same contraption that was placed on the heads of slaves, and it had a tongue, a metal tongue. They went into the tongue and had a spike, and if the women talked, the spike broke the tongue. I talk about that. In fact, actually, I also wanted to have a picture on it, but for some number of reasons we didn't put it. But there's pictures that you can even find on the net of women with this. It was invented in Scotland in the middle of the 16th century, and it was then used extensively. And women would be paraded in the community, you know, with this, and they'll be paraded with a leash to show other women. So we are not talking about capitalism enabling women to talk and to protest. But you had a question. Yes.
I know you've been talking about the rise in technology and the rise in homelessness being linked since the 90s, and you know a lot about housing. Our biggest violence here in the Bay Area is the housing crisis. How would you advise us to reorganize around our housing crisis? Well, the housing crisis is part, very good question, because one of the things, you know, one of my politics in terms of a feminist program is the politics of saying that in whatever form we have to struggle to reappropriate resources. We cannot change. Changing identity is not enough. Right. This is what I'm trying to say, for example, in Beyond the Periphery of the Scale. Right? We have to change the material condition of our life. And changing means reappropriating the resources that we have, that it is land, assets, forests. We cannot think of building commons. You know, commons are not a redistribution of poverty. Commons are not. So one, we have to change the way we organize, the way we reproduce our society and the way we produce. We have to change completely that. But that change cannot take place without a reappropriation. We have to talk about taking back. Taking back, because now capitalism has all our wealth. All our wealth, what our labor, our creativity, our imagination has produced, it's now in their hands and is used against us. Yep. So the challenge of the struggle is to figure out how we are appropriating, what kind of organization, what kind of social relation we have to build about us, how we overcome the way we have been divided so that we have that power, so that we have the solidarity. That too is the struggle. That's it. Thank you. We probably have finished. Oh, one more question? Great. One more question? Yes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I wrote mine down, but I was wondering, how can we understand the current global wave of feminist resistance to sexual violence?
Yeah.
With like the Me Too movement and the Chilean flash mobs and the current like heightened visibility of the International Day to End Violence against women. Because it's on a global high right now.
Yeah.
How do we harness that and connect it to the larger resistance against
Can you repeat the question? The question was, how do we connect the global movement against violence against women to larger issues of anti-capitalist struggle?
I think it's great, you know, Ni Una Menos. I'm very much in contact with women in Ni Una Menos in Argentina. They're there. They have an anti-capitalist perspective. I mean, one of the issues they've been discussing in the last, for example, this last year, has been women and debt, right? La deuda. In fact, they have all this because they realize that part of their violence is also through indebtment, right? And so I think that a lot of it is there, but I think it's a very important question, is what I was saying before. You know, the same with violence. You cannot really effectively struggle against violence against women unless you struggle against the conditions that are producing the violence. Women are being killed because they are defending forests. Think of Berta Cáceres. Think of all the women that have been killed, the men that have been killed just in the last few years after the so-called peace accord in Colombia, right? Think of Marielle Franco. Think of Marielle Franco in Brazil, right? So women are, you know, being killed because they are struggling, because they are refusing, you know, this institutional carceral policy, because there is refusing the destruction of the environment, the destruction of their communities. So that context, the broader context, is necessary. One criticism I have often of the Me Too movement is that often it appears, I'm not saying always, but it appears that the problem is a few men of power who are abusing that power. Yeah, they are abusing that power and should, but it's the system. I think that the real problem, right, because when you talk about the violence, that is taking place in the workplace, for instance, right, and it's taking place in the way people are working, yeah, being exposed to chemical fumes, to be working hours and hours of work that prevents you from being with your family or doing other things or going to all of that is violence. So that this is what I was saying before. In order to deal effectively, against violence, we also have to see what are the economic, social, political conditions that are generating it. And it's not enough to put the blame on a number of men, as clearly the blame has to be put. But it's more systemic. And I think there is a growing consciousness of that today, certainly in Latin America. Yeah. But I think also in the United States. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.